Next up, we have C. Riley Snorton, who is an assistant professor of communication studies at Northwestern University. Snorton's research and teaching focuses on Black cultural production, queer theory, and transgender studies. His first book, Nobody's Supposed to Know, Black Sexuality on the Down Low, traces the emergence and circulation of the down low in news and popular cultures at the turn of the 21st century, and is now currently available from the University of Minnesota Press, just out. Yes!
Yeah, thank you so much for generous introduction, for the invitation. Thank you so much to Jaira for inviting me, for putting this together. I just want to acknowledge before I even get started that I am slain by what I've just seen, and by the conversation that's already been started. So I'm filled with a lot of emotion as I proceed. So, you know, as I said, it's an honor to be on a panel and take part in this two-day series of events that are at the forefront of fostering conversations at and about the intersections of Black, queer, and artistic practice. My relationship to this intersection, like many folks on this panel, is multifaceted. And my work as an academic pays the bills, but I understand the work that I'm doing in the academy is principally, though not exclusively, working at the intersections of Black popular culture, queer and trans life, and perhaps the question of Black, queer, Black, trans livability. To give context to those areas of interest, which I'll detail a bit more toward the end, I wanted to give a kind of truncated autobiography of sorts. So, by truncated, I mean like we're going to get started after I'm already an adult. So we're going to start when I begin at college, right? So I went to college thinking that I'm going to be a classicist, right? So that I would dedicate, you know, several years of my life poring over Latin and ancient Greek. And this is in large part due to my interest in the controversy over Martin Bernal's 3-volume treatment of Blackness in antiquity called The Black Athena. And so Bernal offers up a few arguments which resonated with me. One, which is to say, this thing called race was in operation in Rome and Athens, and so this kind of multicultural revisionist whitewashing of those spaces was exactly that, right? It was cultivated to be that way. And the other argument that was incredibly important to me about his work was this idea that what gets characterized as achievements of early Western civilization are actually deeply indebted to, and that's a nice way of saying it, African art and advancements in science and literature, et cetera, et cetera. So when I got to college, and perhaps this is resonant for many of you, I quickly realized that that wasn't going to work out for me. And I moved into women and gender and sexuality studies. However, I went to school in New York City during the late 90s, early 2000s. So one of the ways I talk about my educational experience is that it was events like 9/11 and the ramp up toward the war on terror, and obviously organizing against the war and figuring out how to map the intersections between anti-Blackness, Islamophobia, xenophobia, white supremacy, right? We can go on and on. That those experiences were equally as instructive as what I learned in the classroom. So I graduated college with a degree in WGS and a minor in African Studies, and went into nonprofit media relations thinking that I would go into nonprofit work as a way of doing less harm, right? Right. And so then working in that area for 3 years, well, obviously to sustain myself spiritually, emotionally, working with grassroots activists along a number of issues, I felt constantly confronted with this feeling of being restricted around the kinds of ideas, politics I could advance as a nonprofit media relations person. And so it was this continuous experience of feeling like my coworkers and I were having these much more progressive, dare I even say radical conversations, and then I was routinely offering up something altogether different in the public sphere as my job. So this experience of constriction led me to graduate school and giving a talk here at NYU, and the recent legislation aimed to silence academics around the boycott, divest, sanctions movement highlights how these sites can also produce similar feelings of constriction. However, I was determined to think about what seemed to be an unthought assumption in nonprofit media relations work, in which visibility was the kind of unambiguous portal to social change. Now, as Janet Mock and Laverne Cox mentioned last night, and as actually many folks who have already graced this mic have eloquently stated, many folks working in the area of media representation come to it because of the power of mass media to shape ideas. And so we can think about news media, for example, as having agenda-setting functions, or television and film as inventing worlds through which we might see what is possible, imaginable for ourselves as audiences. But what was particularly concerning for me in my experiences in the nonprofit world was the idea that this representation to social change, which we might call a formula of sorts, often carried an implicit conservative and assimilationist impulse, in which representation was framed as a matter of inclusion and recognition. So to cite the talk from last night, it wasn't about pushing back against dominant ways of viewing blackness, queerness, transness, etc., but about crafting a story or framing a conversation such that all of these forms of difference would be relatable, palatable, reducible, to mainstream audiences, such that there was an implied analogy that, reified white, cis, straight, etc. as norm, and positioned those who do not share those sets of identifications as making a case for how they were analogous to said norm, right? So in other words, we can think about advocacy, at least in this particular moment, as shaped around this "I'm just like you" paradigm, and to add another dimension, those who were not able to compellingly make that claim, perhaps based on the visibility of being gender nonconforming, of being a person of color, et cetera, et cetera. So those folks who are not able to make that claim were often suppressed, and I would even say actively suppressed in media stories. And here we might think about some sentiments that caused a series of people to organize to restructure the B-roll of the Pride March, for example, right? Where there was this idea that there were too many people from the leather community, too many drag queens, too many drag kings, right? This is not the representation of Pride, which was part of the conversation when I was working in nonprofit media relations in the early 2000s. So, as it might be apparent at this point, I was deeply moved to think about media as acting as a regulatory set of interlocking sites that in turn produced other forms of regulation in the forms of community policing, and we can think of others. And these questions have culminated in a book, and thank you so much for mentioning it. And if you'll allow me, I just want to read just a couple of pages that are explicitly about this notion of representation as it affects how we make sense of, how we imagine Black queer life. And so this is a section from the introduction that is putting forth one of the major arguments of the book, and it's called an improvisation on glass, materializing difference. In 1964, a small Black-owned and operated gay bar called The Big Glass opened on the corner of Fillmore and Sutter Streets in San Francisco. It was among a number of businesses that catered to the influx of more than 40,000 new Black residents to the city's Western Addition after World War II. Surrounded by jazz, blues, and rock and roll venues, The Big Glass enjoyed the patronage of its Black gay clientele until its eventual closure in 1968. During its 4 years of operation, patrons witnessed, and some probably even participated in a 6-day riot in the fall of 1966, which after police shot a Black teen suspected of car theft. Perhaps some of the Big Glass regulars were also members of the Western Addition community organization, Waco, a group of residents, local business owners, church leaders who banded together in 1967 and filed suit against the city's, quote, urban renewal plans for the Fillmore Street area and surrounding areas. More than likely, the big glass went the way of many other businesses in 1968 when the redevelopment agency eventually displaced numerous Fillmore Street businesses and residences under the auspices of rebuilding the neighborhood. There's no record of how the big glass took on its name. In fact, there's little archival evidence of the daily life of the little bar. It's often included in Fillmore histories among a litany of places that represented the heyday of the Fillmore district before its eventual transformation due to local government-led gentrification initiatives. Alternatively, it's given a one-sentence treatment in contemporaneous publications and historical accounts of LGBT social life as the first Black gay bar to emerge in San Francisco. The big glass seems to occupy space, both physically and as a matter of public record, in ways similar to the description from Catherine McKittrick and Clyde Woods on Black geographies. That is, that it discloses, quote, how the racialized production of space is made possible as invisible forgettable, at the same time as invisible forgettable is producing space, always and in all sorts of ways, end quote. Largely forgotten and seemingly naming its invisibility, the big glass notably emerged and persevered during one of the heights of police repression, at the nascent stage of organized Black resistance in the Fillmore, and at a pivotal moment in rock and roll history. Perhaps the allusion to glass signified the ways that queer presence lay at the heart of this historical moment. In any case, the big glass served as a meeting space for patrons at the intersection of at least two forms of stigmatized identification, and its seeming invisibility in the archive gestures to how glass and its chemical properties reveal the politics of visually apprehending difference. In this sense, glass is not merely a metaphor, but is shaped by and embedded within our daily materiality. In fact, it's this materiality that partially explains why down-low narratives emerge and sustain now. We live in a glass-cloaked society, a civilization that requires glass for nearly every aspect of our everyday lives, from eating utensils, mirrors, and storage containers to laptops, cell phones, digital televisions, and an array of other, quote, creature comforts. McFarland and Martin explained to us that, quote, glass, when we do notice glass, right, that it's a ubiquitous substance that's often, quote, invisible, that when we do notice glass, we may find it difficult to place, for it tends to slip between categories. This is one source of its attraction and power. Glass is strange. Chemists find it defies classification. It's neither a true solid nor a true liquid. Glass is brittle, yet infinitely malleable. It's transparent, chemically inert, and durable. It's not coincidental that glass structures our understandings of the representational world. Whether it's the glass that makes up the screens of our television sets and computers, or the mirror, a looking glass that allows us to understand how we might appear to others, this substance is endemic to our understanding of representation and to forms of mediation generally. There are often, if not always, elements of distortion and projection when working with glass. Glass is a medium that carries its own meanings. The glass closet, which is the concept that I develop here to talk about the down low, right, as a kind of invisible but animating presence, a culpable figure that's unlocatable, that allows for us to blame something, someone, for HIV/AIDS rates at the turn of the 21st century among Black folks. So I offer up this glass closet as a way of thinking about how these very quotidian material ways that glass is structuring the very nature of how Black sexuality is imagined. But I want to say that, you know, in closing, that if I might offer up that even as the glass closet is a space that's very explicitly thinking through the dynamics of regulation, that we might also think about the materiality of glass as providing a critical window into how we infer meanings, how we shape our identities, and that those processes also share some of the key properties of glass in being both brittle, breaking readily, and malleable, having a capacity for adaptive change. I'll stop there, and I'm really looking forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you.